I used to believe policy was the last thing that could keep a company standing upright between power, money, and arrogance. But that morning, when I blocked an unauthorized access request from the CEO's son, I had no idea I was not just stopping a dangerous click. I was stopping a disaster. And from that exact moment, they decided to push me out of the very door I had spent years protecting. That morning, what unsettled me was not the request itself. It was the speed. In a company like Titan Shield Systems, sensitive access was never supposed to move quickly. The more dangerous the data, the slower the process should be. The more signatures it should collect. The more eyes it should pass under before anyone even thought about approval. But the request on my screen was gliding upward far too easily, wrapped in polished corporate language about innovation, urgency, and strategic necessity, as if the right vocabulary could make risk disappear. I checked the authority chain, reviewed the security markers, matched the access tier against internal policy. And then I did exactly what my job required me to do. I froze it. Access denied. Review required. It was a small action on the surface. One simple decision inside a larger machine. Yet, I knew those small decisions were often the only reason the machine did not become dangerous. I never treated rules as personal weapons. To me, they were boundaries. The last clean lines in rooms where power often tried to blur everything else. When I blocked that request, I honestly thought the matter should end there. An invalid request had met a correct response. That should have been the whole story. But underneath my professional calm, a familiar instinct had already begun to stir. Something about the motion of that request felt less like a legitimate push and more like someone trying to rush past scrutiny before the light could fully hit it. Experience had taught me that when people try to make a locked door look unreasonable, it usually means what lies behind it is worth fearing more than anything they are saying out loud. Not long after that, Adrian Cole walked into my office without knocking. The way certain men enter spaces they were raised to believe will always rearrange themselves for them. He did not look at me first. He looked at my screen, as though I was merely an obstacle standing next to the real object of his irritation. I remember that expression clearly. It was not pure anger. It was disbelief. The disbelief of someone who had spent his life assuming every boundary was temporary if he wanted it badly enough. He asked why I had blocked his request. I answered calmly that he did not have the proper clearance for that tier of access. Then I turned the screen just enough for him to see the risk flags for himself. I wanted the moment to stay simple, factual, and grounded. But Adrian let out a small, humorless laugh and said he was not asking for a favor. He was advancing a project. I told him that if he wanted to advance something legitimately, he could move it through the proper channel. That was when his face changed. Only for a second. But long enough for me to notice, the confidence did not disappear entirely. It tightened. His eyes moved toward the lower corner of my screen, where the access trail was still visible. And I knew he had realized I had seen more than he intended me to see. The room seemed to lose air for one sharp instant. I said nothing further. But a question had already taken shape in my mind and would not leave me alone for the rest of the day. Why was the CEO's son so desperate to open a door he had no authority to touch? To me, that look on his face mattered more than any argument he made. It was the first sign that this was not an ordinary dispute over timing or workflow. It was something larger. And I had just made myself impossible to ignore. After Adrian left, I could not simply return to my routine. I had the distinct feeling that I had touched the edge of a curtain and discovered an entire hidden room behind it. I went back through the access history, checked the escalation path, traced each irregular reference, and examined every route that seemed even slightly out of alignment with protocol. The more I looked, the less this resembled a standard internal push for speed. It looked carefully dressed, legitimate enough on the surface to blend in, yet engineered to slip around the review steps that existed specifically to stop this kind of access. That was when I stopped doubting my own concern. In my world, people do not ask for exceptional treatment before they have earned the authority, unless they believe the system should bend for them personally. I began documenting everything even more rigorously. Not because I wanted to dramatize the moment, but because women like me in roles like mine survive by letting records speak where people try to distort memory. Spoken words can be twisted. Tone can be reinterpreted. Motive can be painted to suit whoever controls the room. But system logs do not flatter anyone. They do not care about bloodlines, executive charm, or polished strategic language. I kept preserving timestamps, deviations, side references, and the pattern of movement itself. Deep down, I already knew what would happen next. They would not frame me as careful. They would frame me as resistant. They would not say I protected a boundary. They would say I stood in the way of progress. If you are still with me here, comment number 1 below. Because this was the moment I knew the story had stopped being simple. It was no longer about one blocked request. It had become a test between principle and power. And in places like this, the woman protecting the principle is often the first one they try to erase. By midday, the pressure changed form. Adrian did not come back to challenge me directly at first. Instead, he did what men like him always do. When one door refuses to open, he went looking for a weaker lock. Owen Parker from IT called me with the strained hesitation of someone who already knew he was standing in the wrong place. He said Adrian wanted a temporary alignment. Just enough access to keep the project moving. To May, that phrase was even more dangerous than an outright demand. Temporary is one of the most dishonest words in corporate language. It is how permanent damage first enters a system wearing a polite face. I told Owen to keep the lock in place. He lowered his voice and said Adrian claimed the push was coming from above. I did not need clarification. In companies like Titan Shield Systems, that phrase is used as a psychological key. One meant to make other people feel small before they even consider objecting. A few hours later, Vanessa Hart stepped into my office with her measured smile and carefully controlled posture. The kind that can almost pass for kindness if you are not paying attention. She said the company needed a little flexibility right now. I told her the company needed clean approval. Vanessa gave me that polished executive look that says she has already begun assigning you a role in the narrative. She implied I was becoming one of those legacy voices who could not keep pace with transformation. I was not surprised. That is how they do it. They do not call you wrong right away. They call you old, rigid, outdated, so that when they push you aside later, it looks like evolution instead of retaliation. And sitting there in that office, I understood that the campaign against me had already started. Late that afternoon, Ethan Brooks paused at my doorway. He did not come all the way in. And somehow that made the moment more revealing. Men like Ethan rarely step fully inside a problem until they know which direction the collapse is heading. But he only needed one sentence to tell me what mattered. He said I might want to document everything. I told him I already was. He nodded once. And in that small motion, I heard the acknowledgement no one in leadership was willing to make. He saw enough to know this was going bad. After he left, I went deeper into the outside contact patterns and found a structure that made my stomach tighten. There was an AI collaboration path moving at the edges of the system, never fully reviewed, never properly routed through the channels that should have governed it. The project language was glossy and strategic, but the movement beneath it looked like avoidance. Worse, there were communication chains that did not belong in the normal architecture at all. They kept appearing just off to the side, subtle enough to hide, repeated enough to matter. I continued logging. Escalating, preserving, but the whispers around me had already started changing shape. Too rigid, too slow, too cautious for what comes next. I knew how quickly a company could stain a woman's name once it decided she was inconvenient. All it takes is enough repetition. Enough people willing to say, she became the issue, instead of asking what the actual issue was. If this part of the story is hitting you, take a second and like the video. Because what hurts most in places like this is not open hostility. It is watching danger arrive wrapped in elegant language, while the person refusing to look away gets turned into the problem. I sat there that evening under the cold glow of my screen and realized I was no longer just protecting data. I was protecting the truth from a machine already preparing to rewrite me. Toward the end of the day, a message appeared on my screen telling me Graham Cole wanted to see me immediately. I walked upstairs with the uneasy clarity of someone who already knew this would not be a meeting so much as a staging area. When I entered the office, Adrian was already there, seated comfortably, like the room belonged to him by inheritance. Vanessa sat nearby with a folder on her lap, composed in the smooth, prepared way of someone attending an outcome. Not a discussion. Graham stood near the window, hands in his pockets, carrying himself with the ease of a man accustomed to making decisions before anyone else has even finished speaking. He did not ask me to sit. His opening line was that I was creating unnecessary drag on a strategic initiative. I answered with the same facts I had been repeating all day. Adrian did not have the required clearance for that tier of access, and the request had triggered risk markers that required review. Graham turned toward me with visible impatience. Not curiosity. Adrian joined in, saying people like me mistook locking everything down for wisdom when it was really just fear. I kept my attention on Graham and told him this was not about comfort, fear, or innovation. It was about a boundary his son did not have the authority to cross. But by then, the structure of the room was obvious to me. Facts were not going to carry equal weight there. Blood was, status was, the family name was, and the truth hit me with a kind of cold certainty. I had not been called in to explain my decision. I had been called in so they could force me into the role they needed. The obstructive woman standing in the way of their preferred story. Some sentences do not need to be shouted to contaminate an entire room. Graham said I had become rigid, resistant, disruptive to leadership. I heard the familiar architecture of a well-dressed lie immediately. That is always how retaliation begins in powerful spaces. They rename the issue. I was not protecting a boundary. I was resisting change. I was not following procedure. I was undermining leadership. I reminded him that I had done exactly what policy required. Graham cut me off and said the real issue was that I had blocked his son. That single line stripped the meeting bare. Suddenly, the language of innovation fell away. And all that remained was a powerful father, furious that someone had refused to step aside for his child. Then he fired me. No raised voice. No real debate. Just the quiet ugliness of a decision delivered by a man accustomed to removing obstacles from his path. Vanessa slid the paperwork across the desk so quickly. I knew it had been prepared before I ever got the message to come upstairs. It was not a performance review. Not a fact-finding process. Not even a disciplined internal discussion. It was removal paperwork. Waiting to clear the road. I looked at it and felt something colder than anger move through me. It was not only the loss of my job, it was the realization that a company this large could weaponize process so neatly against the woman who had followed it. In that moment, I understood that I was no longer dealing with a difficult executive family. I was standing in front of a culture willing to sacrifice the one person holding the line if doing so protected the illusion of executive invulnerability. I did not sign. I set my badge on Graham's desk and told him the only truth in that room worth hearing: he was not removing a problem. He was removing the last person who still knew where the line was. No one answered me. Adrian gave a quiet laugh. The kind men give when they think they have won, before they understand what game they are actually playing. When the door shut behind me, I knew my career had just been shoved toward the edge in a matter of minutes. But deeper than the shock of losing my position was a heavier realization if Adrian kept reaching through that door. How long before this stopped being a private family distortion and became a genuine catastrophe? They did not drag me out publicly. That would have been simpler. Almost easier to hate. Instead, they gave me the polished version. A quiet escort. An internal security officer walking half a step behind me without touching me. Without hurrying me. Just close enough for everyone to understand I no longer belonged there. In wealthy buildings, humiliation is often delivered with excellent manners. Heads turned as I passed. Some people looked away too quickly. Others gave me that tight, sorry expression people wear when they are relieved the damage landed on someone else. I could already feel the lie hardening around my name before the elevator doors even closed. Difficult. Misaligned. Resistant. If you want more stories like this, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. Because sometimes the most frightening thing inside a company is not the person doing wrong. It is how quickly an entire institution learns to protect that person by rewriting the woman who refused to cooperate. When I got home, the silence hit me harder than Graham's words had. I set my bag down in the kitchen and stood there in the dark for a long moment before finally sitting at the table. Losing the job hurt. Of course. But that was not the part that hollowed me out most. What hurt was knowing exactly how easily they could reshape the record. Not Claire protected a boundary. Not Claire did her job. Instead, Claire slowed the company down. Claire failed to adapt. Claire became the problem. In places like Titan, reputations are not usually destroyed in one violent motion. They are suffocated slowly through repetition. Hallway phrasing. Quiet emails. The meetings you are no longer invited to attend. But I still had one thing they had failed to take from me: the record. I opened my laptop and returned to the logs. The timestamps. The escalation receipts. The access trail. The side references. I read each line with the focus of someone gripping the only intact structure left in a collapsing room. Then the detail that had been scratching at the back of my mind all day sharpened into something clearer. The same outside contact kept appearing. Never through the proper route. Always just beyond the main chain, like a shadow that understood how to avoid the camera. I did not yet have enough to make a sweeping claim, but I had more than enough to justify fear. I did not call anyone. I did not panic. I kept gathering. Ordering. Preserving. There are moments when they can take your title, your office, your badge, your access, and still fail to take everything. As long as I still had the truth and the discipline to hold it carefully, I was not finished. Late that night, I received a brief confirmation that my escalation had been received at a higher level. The message itself was spare, nearly emotionless. But to me it mattered like the first crack of light under a locked door. They had taken my badge and pushed me out of the building. But they no longer had complete control over what stayed inside those walls. The next morning, I could almost picture Titan Shield Systems dressing itself for performance. Fresh coffee, clean glass, screens glowing before dawn had fully settled. Everything arranged to project steadiness, confidence. Command. That is one of the great talents of places like that. They can bury a person by dinner and still serve pastries by 8 as if nothing happened. I was not physically there, but the updates quietly reaching me filled in the picture. Graham was treating the review as proof he had made the correct call in cutting me loose. Adrian was moving across the floor with the swollen ease of someone who believed he had already displaced the old guard. He was congratulating people too early, speaking in smooth phrases about speed, integration, and strategic positioning, as if decades of disciplined defense practice were merely dead weight for a visionary like him to throw off. To May, that blend of confidence and ignorance was more dangerous than open recklessness. Men like Adrian always mistake momentum for legitimacy. They believe that because they are moving fast, they must also be moving correctly. I sat with the evidence in front of me and felt the contradiction sharply. While they were preparing a grand internal display, I was watching the shape of a breach widen in real time through the records they had been too arrogant to treat seriously. The name Simon Reed had begun appearing too often for me to dismiss it. At first it looked like a small irregularity at the edge of the trail. But once I began laying the records beside each other, a pattern emerged that refused to be ignored. Simon appeared in contact chains that did not belong to the standard operating architecture. And those appearances clustered around conversations involving access acceleration, outside AI coordination, and policy avoidance. To Adrian, I suspected Simon was simply a glamorous international bridge, a fast external mind who could make his artificial intelligence ambitions seem bigger, faster, and more globally impressive than they really were. But in my line of work, off-channel contact is never just networking. It is a warning sign. The difference between a legitimate external relationship and a counterintelligence exposure often begins with the exact moment someone decides procedure is optional. I heard that Ethan had started looking pale as the timeline grew uglier. Vanessa, meanwhile, kept smoothing the room with her usual silk-cold composure, repeating that I had been inflexible, that I had resisted change, that everything was under control. But the more desperately people tried to make the situation sound ordinary, the more certain I became that it was not. Distance gave me perspective. I had not fully possessed while sitting inside the building. None of them actually understood the scale of what they were handling. They thought they were accelerating a project. The records were telling a very different story, one involving restricted pathways, avoided scrutiny, and a privileged young executive treating dangerous boundaries as if they were merely outdated inconveniences. That boardroom session had been staged like a launch, not a review. I did not need to be present to imagine the atmosphere because I had spent enough years around Graham to understand how much he loved a room that felt convinced before the evidence even arrived. He would have wanted confidence in the air before the first slide appeared. Adrian was almost certainly introduced, not merely as his son, but as a symbol of where the company was headed. Faster. Bolder. Less constrained by the caution of people like me. The thought made me cold. Not because I envied his spotlight, but because I knew exactly how dangerous an organization becomes when it starts celebrating the bypassing of safeguards as a leadership trait. According to what I heard, Adrian stood before the screen with that polished half-smile of his. The expression of a man expecting agreement as a starting condition. He talked about speed, integration, international reach, future readiness. All the phrases that sound brilliant in rooms where consequences have not entered yet. He spoke as if the systems people had spent years building were merely obstacles to his vision rather than the infrastructure keeping the company from collapsing into legal and security exposure. I sat at home with the logs in front of me and felt the irony like a knife. They were preparing to applaud what looked from their angle like progress. I was watching the evidence of a much uglier reality arrange itself on my screen. There are times in life when the most frightening thing is not that one arrogant man is willing to gamble. It is that an entire room full of educated, experienced people is ready to applaud the gamble because of whose son is making it. Then, the boardroom door opened, and performance collided with consequence. Agent Rachel Stone entered with two others behind her, carrying the kind of calm authority that belongs to people who do not need permission, once they have enough jurisdiction to step in. I was later told that the room went completely dead at once. No one kept smiling. No one kept posturing. Rachel looked directly at Graham and asked why his son was in contact with Simon Reed. That one question altered the room more decisively than any accusation could have. Graham tried to remain in command and asked what this was regarding. Rachel placed a thin packet on the polished table. And I know exactly how deceptive those thin packets can be. They are often the heaviest objects in the room because they contain only what cannot be explained away: contact records, timestamps, connection patterns, access attempts, clean pages, carrying brutal weight. Adrian rushed to frame it as exploratory outreach, strategic engagement, harmless intent. But that is where men like him always fail to understand the world outside executive protection. Consequences are not decided by the story they prefer about themselves. They are decided by the record they created. Rachel said there was off-channel contact connected to sensitive data pathways, unauthorized effort toward restricted access, and behavior that created a counterintelligence exposure. In that instant, I imagine Graham's face must have changed. No longer a father managing a difficult internal disagreement. No longer a CEO disciplining a stubborn employee. Just a man realizing the floor beneath him now belonged to a system much larger and harsher than the one he controlled inside his own company. When Rachel Stone said the matter had become a federal espionage case, every internal justification died where it stood. Innovation, flexibility, strategic urgency. All of it instantly shrank beneath the weight of a legal and national security framework, far beyond anything Graham could bend with influence. I was not there to see Adrian's laptop taken from his hands in the middle of that room. But I did not need to see it to understand what it meant. For the first time since the previous morning, the truth had landed somewhere. It could no longer be brushed aside. I had not blocked an idea. I had blocked a disaster. And the bitterest part was that my warning only became real to them once federal agents walked through the door. That hurt more than I expected. Because at Titan, apparently, the voice of the woman who had spent years protecting the company's compliance boundaries was still lighter than the CEO's family power until a government badge entered the frame. But once that happened, the story changed direction completely. Adrian stopped being the rising heir. He became the center of an investigation. Graham stopped being the man in control of the room. He became the man being questioned. And Titan stopped being a company confidently moving into the future. It became an organization forced into a violent stop before it crossed much darker lines. I sat there watching updates arrive and felt something steadier than vindication. Truth, when it returns with evidence and authority, does not need to shout. It simply leaves everyone else with nowhere honest to stand. By lunchtime, no one was waiting for an official statement to understand that everything had fractured. In institutions like Titan, reputations change state before documentation ever catches up. First come the lowered voices, then the careful silence, then the abrupt disappearance of the title that used to enter a room before a person did. Adrian traveled that entire distance in a single morning. One day, he had been framed as the future. The next, he was simply the case. That shift sounds small, but it matters. It is the moment an organization starts removing protective distance from the person it once shielded most aggressively. The board called an emergency governance session. Gone were the polished phrases and strategic optimism. What remained was damage, paper, and fear, dressed in expensive clothing. Ethan finally handed over the older email chains. The warnings that had been raised before. The questions about off-channel contact. The concerns that had been allowed to die quietly, while Graham cleared space for his son to perform as a visionary. Vanessa was pulled in next. The speed of my firing. The timing. The paperwork already prepared before the meeting had even ended. None of it looked efficient anymore. It looked like cleanup. And once an organization starts being viewed through that lens, every carefully professional explanation begins to reveal its uglier purpose underneath. The company had not merely made a bad judgment call. It had retaliated against the one person trying to stop something dangerous. And now that retaliation was part of the crisis itself, by late afternoon, the fracture lines were visible everywhere. Legal was rattled. Internal teams were shaken. The board was split between those trying to save the company and those still trying to save Graham from his own choices. But the more evidence surfaced, the less room loyalty had to operate. Henry Walsh, the board chair, finally said the sentence that stripped the family drama down to its actual bones. He said this was not a family embarrassment. It was a leadership failure. When I heard those words relayed back to me, I sat very still, because that had always been the truth. The problem was never just one reckless executive son. It was a structure in which the man at the top used the company like a private shield for his family, and treated the one woman who obeyed the rules as expendable. Before sunset, Henry's office reached out to me directly. Not Graham. Not Vanessa. The board? Their language was careful and almost humble, asking whether I would come in the next morning to clarify the system trail, the timing, and the blocked request that had now become central to a federal review. Companies learn manners remarkably fast when consequences become real. I agreed to meet. Not because I missed my office, and not because I wanted my chair returned. I agreed because the truth deserved a cleaner room than the one it had been thrown out of the day before. The next morning, I walked back into the building carrying a thin folder and my laptop. Nothing about me looked dramatic. But inside, I felt entirely different from the woman who had been quietly escorted out the previous day. Then, I had left as a name being smeared in real time. Now, I was returning as the person carrying the memory the system could not revise. I did not come to perform outrage. I did not come to humiliate anyone. I did not even come to accuse. I simply laid the pieces down one by one: access logs, timestamps, escalation receipts, the note attached to Adrian's request, the chain showing exactly what I had seen, exactly what I had blocked, and exactly how quickly I had been punished for doing so. I let the evidence speak in the plain language of sequence and pattern. With every additional page, the room grew quieter. That kind of silence has always meant more to me than apology, because it only arrives when people begin to realize there is no clean rhetorical escape left. By the time I finished, no one was asking whether I had overreacted. They were staring at the uglier version of the story in full. I had done my job. I had been removed for holding a boundary in place, and the company had pushed itself into a federal review because a father decided his son mattered more than the line that should have stopped both of them. Some victories do not sound triumphant. They sound like a room going still when the truth finally no longer needs to beg for recognition. By noon, the board ordered Graham to step away from all operational authority, pending the outcome of the investigation. Vanessa was placed under internal review. Then came the offer. Everyone in that room seemed to think was both necessary and generous. They wanted me back immediately. Same building. Same halls. Same institution that had thrown me aside. Only now, the tone was urgent, respectful, and edged with fear. I looked at Henry for a long moment before I answered. What happened to me had never been a technical misunderstanding. It had been a choice. They had chosen to ignore warnings. Chosen to protect privilege instead of process. Chosen to break the woman doing the right thing, instead of stopping the man doing the wrong thing. So I told them they could restore my name, but they could not restore the trust they had spent. No one interrupted me. I left the folder on the table and gave them the sentence they had earned. Graham had not fallen because he loved his son too much. He had fallen because he had used a company like a family shield and treated the only person following the rules as disposable. Saying those words brought me an unexpected calm. Not because the damage had disappeared, but because the story was finally standing upright. I was no longer trapped inside their version of me, as the difficult woman resisting the future. I was the woman who had kept a dangerous door closed, while the people calling themselves visionary tried to force it open for reasons rooted in ego, vanity, and entitlement. By the end of that week, Graham was forced to resign. No elegant corporate wording could soften what everyone now understood. He had not protected leadership. He had corrupted it. Adrian was removed next. Not only from the building, but from every succession chart. Every leadership memo. Every polished internal story about the next generation. I found that especially fitting. He had wanted to be seen as the future. Now his name had become something people quietly removed from slides before meetings began. Vanessa lost her place for the reason people like her so often. Should she addressed retaliation in the language of process? Clean hands and appearance. Dirty purpose underneath. Ethan remained, but not untouched. Some prices are not paid through termination. Some are paid through memory. Through having to live with the exact moment you saw danger, understood it, and still did not place yourself fully in its path until the fire reached your own hallway. Henry personally announced the new safeguards. No family member of senior leadership would ever again be allowed to cross access boundaries without full process. Security escalations could bypass executive management when necessary. And retaliation against compliance personnel would trigger immediate board review. I listened to those reforms with mixed feelings. Relief. Certainly. But not innocence. Strong policies matter. They always do. Still, no policy can automatically heal a culture that once chose silence in the presence of concentrated power. I agreed to help through the transition, but only as an independent advisor. I was not going back to serve beneath a polished new version of the same old culture. That was the most important difference I came to understand. My victory was never the title, the office, or the chair. It was my name. My record was no longer twisted into resistance, fear, or failure. No one could tell this story now and make me the problem without exposing themselves as part of what had gone wrong. A few days later, in a waiting area, I saw Adrian's face on a television screen under a banner about the expanding investigation. For the first time, he was not the heir. He was just a name in a file. I did not feel joy when legal analysts said the espionage charges alone could expose him to as much as 20 years. I felt clarity. Some people believe rules are fences for ordinary lives, while men like them are meant to have gates, private roads, and keys no one else can touch. But life has a merciless way of waiting at the end of that road with a bill no one else can pay for them. I blocked him from the data. No one could block him from the consequences. Thank you for watching this story all the way through. If it stayed with you, please leave one like and one subscription to support the channel, and stay with me for the next video.